Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating paradox. How could a man who built this incredible empire, one meant to last for, what, tens of thousands of years, how could he be so utterly consumed by his own personal fear of death? It's not just a riddle, it's really the defining irony of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China.
It really is.
You see, he was this monumental figure, Ying Zhang, originally king of Qin. He's the one who finally ended that brutal warring states period.
Decades of conflict.
Exactly, conquering 6 rival states between 230 and 221 BCE. But he didn't just conquer, did he?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He unified what we now think of as China for the very first time. And then he establishes himself as Qin Shi Huangdi, a title that basically screamed, this is a whole new era.
Right.
And it wasn't just, a new name. It was a massive shift. He wasn't satisfied with just winning wars. He set out to create a truly unified nation.
By standardizing everything.
Pretty much everything, yeah. Think about it. One single written language, even though people spoke all sorts of different dialects, a common currency, unified weights and measures. He even standardized the width of cart axles.
Really? Axles?
Yeah, to make travel and trade easier on the roads he was building. These were foundational acts, really staggering in their scope. They laid the absolute bedrock for imperial China.
It paints a picture of just incredible vision, but also absolute control, absolute order. Yet, like you said, the central irony of his later life is just so stark. This man achieves unparalleled power, builds this legacy he thinks will last forever. And at the same time, becomes completely obsessed with extending his own physical life to the point where he's actually neglecting the future of his dynasty.
Precisely.
So this wasn't just like a private eccentricity. It actually became tangled up with the state itself. How does a personal fear get that big?
That's the crucial point. His search for immortality wasn't some personal hobby tucked away somewhere. It became state policy. It consumed enormous resources. It influenced major decisions. So our deep dive today, we're going to explore the sort of psychological drivers behind this fear. We'll trace the, frankly, catastrophic consequences his obsession had for the succession, for who came after him.
Right.
And we'll look at the philosophical, the historical ways people tried to make sense of why the Qin Dynasty fell apart so quickly. I mean, just 15 years.
Which brings us back to that interesting question you raised earlier about karma. You said that's not quite the right lens for this period.
Yeah, exactly. Buddhist ideas of karma, they just weren't really widespread in China back then during the Qin Dynasty. That influence came much, much later.
Right.
Instead, we need to delve into a really powerful native Chinese philosophical concept from that era, one that gives a much more direct answer for how people at the time, and later historians, understood why dynasties rise and fall.
Okay, looking forward to that. But let's start with the man himself, the sole architect of this empire. His journey from, a prince in a warring state to the first emperor must have profoundly shaped him.
Oh, absolutely. And what's really striking here is unlike earlier kings who, inherited their thrones, Qin Shi Huang built his entire empire basically from scratch, out of the chaos of war. That creates a unique psychological weight, doesn't it?
Yeah, you can imagine.
The idea that if I die, everything I built just vanishes. That became this powerful, maybe almost unbearable driving force for him. It wasn't just the normal human fear of dying.
No.
It was this terror that his whole life's work, this monumental creation, would just disappear with him. That's what made his desire for immortality so much more intense, perhaps, than any ruler before him.
So given that extraordinary life, maybe his paranoia wasn't just sort of random instability. Maybe it was almost a logical response to everything he'd been through. Can you unpack the origins of that fear a bit more?
Well, the roots go deep. Right back to his childhood as Ying Zhen. He actually lived as a political hostage in Zhao, a rival state. Imagine that. It must have instilled this profound sense of insecurity, of deep distrust, the constant threat, feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. Then later, when he finally becomes king, this vulnerability gets hammered home by this massive scandal involving his own mother, the Queen Dowager Zhao, and her affairs.
Right, that was quite the story.
He had to brutally suppress it. He ended up executing his own 2 half-brothers, imprisoning his mother. That kind of betrayal right at the heart of his family.
Well, it leaves scars, doesn't it?
Yeah, profound trauma, isolation. It makes you wonder how you'd trust anyone after that. And he never even named an official empress, did he?
No, he didn't. And his life was just punctuated by constant threats. Throughout his reign, assassination attempts were almost routine.
Like the famous one.
Yeah, the one by Jin Kai in 227 BCE. This desperate assassin nearly gets him right there in the throne room. Qin Shi Huang apparently had to scramble for his own sword. These weren't abstract fears, they were real, violent events, keeping him constantly on edge, constantly suspicious.
Exactly. It must have seemed like anyone could be an enemy.
And, let's be honest, he certainly made a lot of enemies himself, didn't he? His rule was strict, often brutal. That legalist approach alienated so many people.
Oh, definitely. The old nobility from the states he conquered, intellectuals who value different philosophies. The whole burning of books and burying of scholars policy is probably the most infamous example. He was trying to stamp out dissenting ideas, especially from Confucian scholars who criticized his rule for lacking, virtue.
Right.
These actions created this atmosphere of terror, sure, but they also guaranteed he'd be surrounded by people wanting revenge. So in that context, death wasn't just a natural end.
No, it was like the ultimate defeat.
Exactly. It was the ultimate victory for his enemies. So seeking immortality became his ultimate strategy to permanently defeat everyone, a profound way to assert control in the life that was always about battling for it.
It's a striking parallel, isn't it, to other really powerful rulers known for extreme paranoia.
Yeah.
It seems like absolute power, maybe combined with that deep inner insecurity, often pushes people to try and control the uncontrollable, like death itself.
And what's particularly striking is how that fear, that drive, led him to pour vast state resources into this impossible task of finding immortality.
Right.
And this quest, it took many forms. He dispatched huge expeditions trying to find mythical islands. He sponsored alchemists right there at the court.
That famous quest with Fu.
Right.
The alchemist he sent off with thousands of young boys and girls to the East Sea.
That's the one. Searching for Penglai, this legendary island of the immortals. They never came back.
And there's that intriguing theory they might have ended up in Japan.
It's a possibility, but regardless of where they ended up, that expedition just shows his willingness to commit absolutely immense resources based on just a glimmer of hope. And back at court, yeah, he sponsored loads of alchemists, Taoist priests, anyone who claimed they could cook up an elixir of life. Now, this partly reflected popular folk Taoist beliefs about living forever.
Okay.
But mostly it showed his utter desperation. He was ready to believe almost any charlatan who offered him that hope.
And the tragic irony, of course, is that those very elixirs often contained mercury.
Yes. Deadly poison.
Believing they'd make him immortal.
His consumption of these things, these poisons, almost certainly contributed to his deteriorating health and ultimately his death. He died relatively young, only 49, while he was out on a tour of the Eastern Empire.
So he sought to conquer death, but death conquered him through the very means he thought would save him.
Precisely. A terribly ironic end.
And beyond trying to live forever in this world, his preparations for the afterlife were just monumental. The mausoleum, the terracotta army.
Oh, unbelievable. A miniature empire for the underworld. Over 8,000 terracotta warriors discovered so far, each one unique. All meant to serve and protect him in the next life. It's just this astonishing testament to his belief in the continuation of his power, even after death.
And there's more, isn't there? Sima Qian, the great Han Dynasty historian.
Yes. His Records of the Grand Historian is our main source for so much of this.
He described rivers and seas of mercury inside the tomb itself.
He did. And modern scientific surveys have actually found abnormally high mercury levels in the soil all around the tomb mound.
Wow, so it confirms the ancient records.
It strongly suggests it, yes. That tomb is maybe the clearest, most tangible link between his fear of death and his grand preparations for it. It's still unexcavated today, partly because of those mercury concerns, but also the sheer challenge of preserving whatever's inside.
What a profound irony, though. It just highlights how even a man who could command armies, reshape landscapes, build the Great Wall, was utterly helpless against the most fundamental law of nature. That's a pretty poignant reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some things are just beyond human control, no matter how powerful you are.
Absolutely. And his quest for immortality, it wasn't just a private thing. It was a state project reflecting his absolute power. He genuinely seemed to believe, if I can command the world to build walls and armies, I can command it to make me an elixir.
But nature had other ideas.
Indeed. Dying from the very poisons meant to grant him immortality. It's a stark ending. It shows that even the most powerful man on earth couldn't conquer the laws of nature and death.
Okay, so we've explored the roots of his fear, this intense psychological pressure. Now, it's really critical to understand how this obsession started to unravel the very empire he built, particularly how he handled the succession.
This is arguably the greatest mistake Qin Shi Huang made for his dynasty's future, his handling, or rather mishandling, of the succession. Prince Fusu, he was the eldest son, the rightful heir, and historical accounts describe him as intelligent, compassionate, respected.
Right.
Crucially, he leaned towards Confucian ideals, governing through virtue, benevolence, a real contrast to his father's strict legalism.
And he actually voiced that, didn't he? He objected to his father's burying of scholars policy.
He did. Famously, he argued it would destabilize the new empire, alienate people.
Which highlights that philosophical gap between them.
And that dissent really angered Qin Shi Huang. So he decided to send Fusu away up to the northern frontier.
To oversee the Great Wall construction.
Yeah, under General Meng Tian, supposedly for training. But it turned out to be a disastrous strategic mistake.
Because it took him away from the capital.
Exactly. It removed the legitimate, capable heir from the center of power, left him isolated, vulnerable to political maneuvering back in Xinjiang.
It seems almost certain, looking back, that if Fusu had stayed in the capital, the conspiracy that happened after Qin Shi Huang died would have been, well, maybe impossible.
It's a very strong probability, yes. Had Fusu become emperor, it's likely he would have softened legalism's harsh edges with Confucian ideas.
Potentially calming things down.
Maybe appeasing some of the public discontent, perhaps winning over some of the old noble families. A path the Han Dynasty later took, very successfully.
Right.
So Qin Shi Huang, banishing Fusu, he was basically, without knowing it, opening the door for his dynasty's own destruction.
So then Qin Shi Huang dies suddenly in 210 BCE. He's on tour, far from the capital. The stage is perfectly set for a plot.
Perfectly set. Only a handful of top officials were with him on that tour.
Who were they?
You had Chancellor Li Si.
The main legalist architect.
Right. You had the chief eunuch, Zhao Gao, who was incredibly cunning, and the emperor's youngest son, Prince Huai.
Okay.
Now, Zhao Gao had actually been Huai's tutor. He saw this golden opportunity. Put a weak puppet emperor on the throne, one he could control.
And he managed to convince Li Si.
He did. Li Si, despite being this powerful legalist chancellor, had a rocky relationship with Fusu. He was genuinely afraid that if Fusu became emperor, Fusu might get rid of him. Because Fusu was close to General Meng Tian, who was Li Si's big political rival. So Li Si feared for his own position, maybe even his life.
So different motives, but they shared this destructive goal. They conspire. What was the actual plan?
Okay, first, they concealed the emperor's death, kept it secret while the imperial entourage traveled back towards the capital.
How did they manage that?
Apparently, they loaded carts with salted fish to mask the smell of the decaying body during the summer heat.
Grim.
Then they forged the emperor's will. The real one had named Fusu as heir. They created a fake imperial decree, supposedly from Qin Shi Huang, and sent it north to Fusu and Meng Tian. This fake decree accused them both of ungratefulness and incompetence and ordered them to commit suicide.
And the truly heartbreaking part is that Fusu, he believed it.
He did. He was apparently deeply filial, perhaps too respectful of imperial authority. He didn't question the decree.
And he killed himself.
He committed suicide. Meng Tian refused, initially. He was arrested, imprisoned, and later forced to drink poison anyway.
So just like that, the rightful heir and the empire's most capable general are gone.
Eliminated, clearing the path completely. With Fusu and Meng Tian out of the way, they rushed back to the capital and put the young, foolish, cruel Prince Huai on the throne as Qin Er Shi, the second emperor.
It was just a perfect storm, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Ambition, fear, ideological conflict.
And the fragility of the system itself, this hyper-centralized state, so dependent on one man at the top, it just proved too brittle to handle a chaotic transition like that.
And under Qin Er Shi, who was basically Zhao Gao's puppet, things got even worse.
Oh, much worse. Taxes went up, forced labor intensified, got to pay for the court's luxuries and keep building things right. And Zhao Gao just systematically eliminated anyone he saw as a rival, including Li Si himself.
Really? He's a co-conspirator.
Yep. Eventually, Zhao Gao framed Li Si for treason and had him executed, supposedly by the waist chop method. It became a total reign of terror. Loyalty was constantly being tested in the most brutal ways.
And that leads to maybe the most infamous story illustrating Zhao Gao's power and just the sheer absurdity of the court. The idiom pointing to a deer as a horse.
Ah, yes. Zilu Wei Ma. It's a classic.
Tell us about it. How did that happen?
So the story goes, Zhao Gao wanted to test who in the court was truly loyal to him versus those who might still dare to defy him.
Okay.
So he brings a deer into the court, presents it to the emperor, Qin Er Shi, and declares, "Your Majesty, a magnificent horse."
A deer.
A deer. The emperor, confused, says something like, "Chancellor, you're mistaken. That's clearly a deer."
Great.
Zhao Gao then turns to all the other officials present and asks them, "Is this a deer or a horse?"
Oh, the pressure.
Exactly. Those officials who were too afraid of Zhao Gao or wanted his favor said, "It is indeed a horse, Your Excellency." But those few who dared to speak the truth and said, "Well, actually, it's a deer,"
They were noted down.
Zhao Gao noted them down, and later he had them all secretly purged or executed. So that incident became this incredibly powerful proverb in Chinese culture, meaning deliberately misrepresenting something, twisting facts, usually to assert power or test loyalty. It perfectly symbolized the decay, the fear, the sheer irrationality that had taken over the Qin court.
It's such a timeless warning, isn't it? About how absolute power can just warp reality itself. And it still resonates today. What does it tell us about the dangers of that kind of unchecked power, that corrupted leadership?
It's a lesson for the ages, really.
So this cruelty, this failed governance, this deer horse situation, it created a powder keg. What was the spark that finally set it off?
The first spark came in 209 BCE, just a year after Qin Er Shi took the throne. It started with a small group of peasants, led by two men, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. They were conscripted soldiers, basically peasants forced into the army, heading to the northern border, but they got delayed by heady rains.
And under Qin law?
Under Qin's incredibly strict laws, missing a deadline like that, even due to weather, meant automatic execution.
So they were doomed either way.
Exactly. Faced with certain death if they showed up late or death if they rebelled, they chose rebellion. Chen Sheng rallied them with this really powerful, almost revolutionary question. He asked, "Are kings, nobles, generals, and ministers born into their stations?"
Wow, challenging the whole system Qin Shi Huang had built.
Fundamentally challenging it, and that small uprising just ignited rebellions like wildfire across the entire empire.
Everyone joined in?
You had suffering peasants rising up everywhere. You had remnants of the old nobility from the conquered states seeing a chance to get their power back. And you had ambitious new warlords emerging, like Liu Bang and Shang Yu, who would become major players.
And the Qi army couldn't handle it.
The army was in disarray. Their best general, Meng Tian, was dead. The leadership back in the capital under Zhao Gao was chaotic and corrupt. They just couldn't cope with revolts breaking out simultaneously all over the place.
The dynasty crumbled quickly.
Incredibly quickly. By 207 BCE, Liu Bang's rebel forces were approaching the capital, Shanyang. Zhao Gao, terrified he'd be blamed for the mess.
Turns on the emperor.
He forces Qin Er Shi to commit suicide. Then, in a desperate move, he puts Ziying, who was actually Fusu's son.
The original heir's son.
Yes, puts him on the throne, but only as a powerless king, not emperor. But Ziying actually managed to outmaneuver Zhao Gao. He pretended to be sick, lured Zhao Gao into a private meeting, and had him killed.
A little bit of justice, but too late.
Way too late. The empire was collapsing. Ziying knew he had no hope. He formally surrendered to Liu Bang when Liu Bang's army entered the capital. And that was it. The end of the Great Qin Dynasty, just 15 years after its founding.
So it wasn't an external invasion, it was a total internal implosion.
Absolutely. A direct result of that disastrous succession crisis, fueled by Zhao Gao's ambition and Li Si's fear, and also a result of the legalist system itself.
How so?
It was designed for war, for absolute control. But it proved far too rigid, too brittle, too harsh for governing a vast, diverse empire in peacetime. Its inflexibility, like, executing soldiers for being delayed by rain, turned what could have been minor problems into empire-shattering crises.
This brings us right back to that philosophical question you raised at the start. We talked about why karma isn't quite the right fit, historically, for understanding the Qin collapse. So what is the philosophical answer from that time?
That's a great question, because to really get how people in that era made sense of these monumental events, we need to look at the homegrown Chinese philosophies that were swirling around then, the so-called 100 schools of thought.
Okay, and the main ones relevant here are legalism, Confucianism, and Taoism, right? How did they play into Qin Shi Huang's rule and how people viewed its fall?
Exactly. So legalism, as we've said, was the official state philosophy of Qin. It basically believed humans are inherently selfish, so you need strict laws, harsh punishments, and the ruler's authority must be absolute. Li Si was the key proponent, shaping Qin's whole centralized authoritarian structure. Confucianism was its main ideological opponent. It advocated ruling through virtue, benevolence, proper ethics, strong family ties, social harmony. Fusu, the lost heir, leaned this way. And Confucians were the main targets of Qin Shi Huang's book, Burning. Then you have Taoism. Philosophical Taoism talked about Wu Wei, governing through non-action, sort of letting things be, distrusting too many man-made rules. But it was the folk Taoist element, with its focus on achieving longevity, finding elixirs, becoming immortal. That was the part that really grabbed Qin Shi Huang personally.
So his reign was this really fascinating, maybe catastrophic clash of philosophies. He's ruling the empire with the iron fist of legalism. But his personal life, his deepest obsession, is driven by this almost superstitious folk Taoism. What did that internal contradiction mean for the empire?
It's pretty profound when you think about it. That contradiction, ruthless logic for the state, irrational fantasy for himself, arguably destroyed both him and his dynasty.
Oh, so?
Well, his legalist power gave him the immense resources needed to fund his Taoist-inspired search for immortality elixirs. But those very elixirs, these flawed human creations, likely poisoned him and cut his life short. It was almost like nature itself asserting its supreme power over human attempts to control everything, proving the Taoist philosophers right in a way he never intended.
So if we're looking for the culturally appropriate moral explanation for why the Qin dynasty collapsed, what concept captures that?
The most fitting, the most powerful concept from that era is the mandate of heaven, Tianming.
Tianming. Okay.
This was a very ancient Chinese political idea. It basically said that heaven, this sort of cosmic moral force, granted the right to rule to a just and virtuous ruler. The emperor was the son of heaven, and his job was to care for the people.
But it wasn't a blank check, right?
Yeah, not at all. It wasn't permanent. If a ruler became cruel, corrupt, incompetent, oppressed the people, heaven would show its displeasure and withdraw the mandate. And then the dynasty would inevitably fall.
And how would people know? What were the signs that heaven had withdrawn its support?
The traditional signs were things like natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, famine, widespread corruption, and, crucially, popular uprisings. A successful rebellion was seen as clear proof that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the old rulers and bestowed it upon new ones.
So the Qin dynasty's collapse became the textbook example.
Absolutely. The quintessential example of losing the mandate of heaven. Later scholars, especially in the Han dynasty that followed, pointed directly to Qin Shi Huang's cruelty, the excessive forced labor on things like the wall on his tomb, the chaos and tyranny under the second emperor, all as clear evidence that heaven had abandoned the Qin. Jie Yi's famous essay, The Faults of Qin, laid this out very powerfully.
And this interpretation wasn't just, objective historical analysis, was it? It served a political purpose, too.
Oh, definitely. It was also brilliant propaganda for the new Han dynasty. By framing Qin's downfall as a moral failure, as the judgment of heaven, it helped legitimize the Han rulers, particularly Liu Bang, who started as a commoner. It positioned them as the rightful successors chosen by heaven to restore order, virtue, and prosperity.
Okay.
So the mandate of heaven, that's the historically and culturally accurate answer to your original question about a concept like karma. It was the framework people used to understand the moral dimension of political power, why dynasties rose and inevitably fell. Qin's fall wasn't just political, it was deliberately shaped into this profound moral lesson for all future emperors.
It's really clear, then, that the picture we have of Qin Shi Huang was heavily shaped by those who came after him, particularly the Han historians like Sima Qian writing the records of the Grand Historian.
Yes, undeniably.
But what's fascinating now is how archaeological discoveries are starting to maybe challenge or at least nuance that traditional narrative.
That's a really important point. Discoveries like the Shuhudi Qin bamboo slips, these were found in the tomb of a pretty low-ranking Qin official from that period.
And what's on them?
Detailed laws, administrative regulations, case records, and what they reveal isn't necessarily a state ruled by pure arbitrary cruelty.
No.
Instead, they paint a picture of a highly rational, incredibly complex, and quite systematic bureaucracy. The laws were definitely strict, very strict by any standard, but they seem to have been applied systematically even to officials themselves. It suggests a state governed more by process, even if harsh, rather than just pure whim or emotion.
Okay, that's a different angle.
And even that infamous burning of books and burying of scholars incident is being re-examined. While dissent was brutally suppressed, it seems some forbidden texts were actually kept safe in the imperial library.
Oh, interesting.
And some scholars now argue the scholars who were supposedly buried alive might have primarily been those court alchemists who failed to deliver the immortality elixirs Qin Shi Huang craved, rather than purely Confucian intellectuals targeted for their philosophy.
So the reality of the Qin state might have been this extraordinarily efficient, if severe, legalist machine that was perceived as tyrannical, partly because it was such a radical break from past traditions, and because it imposed such an immense human cost on people used to different ways.
That's the nuance historians are exploring now. The Han narratives, while definitely biased against the Qin, probably captured the emotional truth of the suffering people experienced under Qin rule, even if some specific events were exaggerated for political effect.
Right.
Today, Qin Shi Huang's legacy is just incredibly complex, isn't it? He's still seen as both this ruthless tyrant and the undeniable unifier who laid the foundation for China as we know it.
Yeah.
And that complexity echoes even in modern times. Mao Zedong, notoriously, once boasted that he'd surpassed Qin Shi Huang 100 times over in suppressing intellectuals. A chilling comparison.
It really is. So this deep dive has really shown us, I think, that Qin Shi Huang's obsessive pursuit of immortality wasn't just some personal fantasy. It was deeply psychological, tied into his life's work. As the sole architect of that empire, he seemed to fuse its survival completely with his own. His fear of death became a fear for his entire creation.
Exactly. And that very obsession, that fusion, led directly to those fatal political mistakes. Neglecting the succession plan, sending Fusu away, putting far too much trust in ambitious, unscrupulous figures like Zhao Gao and Li Si. These weren't small errors. They created a perfect power vacuum that just swallowed the dynasty whole almost the moment he died.
So circling right back to your initial question about karma and the right framework, it's clear that within that ancient Chinese context, the best answer really is the mandate of heaven.
It provides the most fitting explanation from their perspective. His harsh rule, the suffering of the people, the chaos that followed his death, subsequent generations read all of that as clear signs heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Qin.
Right.
The very ruthlessness that let him conquer and unify proved too rigid, too brittle in the end. It undermined the wisdom and foresight needed to make the empire actually last.
Qin Shi Huang's legacy.
Yeah.
It's still so fiercely debated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ruthless tyrant, yes, but also this monumental unifier who really did lay the bedrock for China.
Undeniably both.
His story really feels like a timeless lesson about the corrosive nature of absolute power, maybe the futility of trying to defy fundamental natural laws like death.
Yeah.
And that profound truth that maybe a ruler's true legacy isn't just measured by what they built for themselves, but by what they leave behind to secure the future for everyone else.
Well put.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What might his story teach us about leadership and legacy today? About the lasting impact a leader's personal fears, their personal obsessions can have on an entire nation?